Okay, so I think we'll start here. At least on my computer it says that it's 30 minutes after the hour, and then depending on which time zone you're in, that means different things. But welcome in any case to everybody to this organized session number 45 on COVID-19 jobs and long-run trade patterns. Well, my name first is Lars Nilsson. I'm the Deputy Head of Chief Economist Trade Analysis and Evaluation Unit of the Commission's Trade Directorate General. And our session today is hosted by Angel Aguiar, who will make sure that everything works out the way they are supposed to work out, and including that he will remind presenters of time. So each presentation will be 20 minutes, and Angel will tell you when there's 2 minutes left in your allotted time. And then following that, we'll have discussion periods of 10 minutes. And I believe that if you want to take the floor and ask a question, indicate that in the chat box so I can give you the word. You can also put, if you want to, write the question in the chat box and I can read it out for you. It works very well either way. I would like also to just remind you that if you're not speaking, please mute yourself so we get rid of potential echoes. And I think with having said that, I should actually perhaps also say which papers we have in the session today. We have the session, which by the way is co-jointly organized with the WTO. We have a first paper on the impact of COVID on export-related jobs in the European Union by Zornica Kotlina Dimitrova. We have a second presentation, which is the resilience of the EU single market, and this paper will be presented by Luca Salvatici and not Alessandro Antimiani. And we have a third paper, which is called The Way Forward, the Impact of Future Trade Policies and Global Trade Patterns by Jean Métivier. So, having said that, I pass the word and the floor to you, Sunitsa.
Thank you very much, Lars. I would just now share the content of my presentation. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Very good. Perfect. So, thanks a lot, and hello everybody from Brussels. I'm very glad to be here and to present to you our latest research on the impact of COVID-19 on exports-related jobs in the European Union. Before I start, I would like to mention that that's a joint research with a colleague from GRC Sevilla, José Manuel Rueda Cantuche. So on this slide, you see the content of my presentation. I'll first talk about the impact of COVID-19 on world and EU economies in respect to GDP and trade developments. Then I will present to you the approach we have followed in this paper and how we have designed the different scenarios. I would also briefly talk about the Figaro database, the newest multi-region input-output table database of the European Union. And then I will present the results of our analysis to you on the impact of COVID-19 on exports-related jobs before I conclude my presentation. So, we know that the impact of COVID has been drastic. So global demand for goods and services decreased by 3.3%, and there has been a substantial reduction in global world trade of 8.5%. The pandemic has also heavily disrupted the sourcing of foreign value added along global supply chains and has forced, in many cases, companies to change their decision in respect to their preferred choice of optimal intermediate inputs mix. What we know also that this trend applies worldwide. However, some regions have been hit harder than others. And another important point I would like to make is that in the response to the pandemic, many countries, and here all, including all EU countries, have implemented large exceptional support measures to dampen the social impact of COVID-19 and to prevent real job losses. Now here I'm showing you on this chart the impact of COVID in respect to global GDP and trade. I think this chart is very telling because I have purposely introduced the year 2009, where you can see the impact of the global financial crisis. And just to compare, to give you some kind of first impression of the strength of the COVID-19 crisis, particularly on GDP. So as we see on this chart, 2009 financial crisis barely affected GDP, where GDP decreased just by 0.1%. However, trade flows collapsed quite drastically by approximately 10%. Now, looking at the COVID crisis, what we see in 2020, that the shock to GDP was far more pronounced. As I mentioned, it decreased in real terms by 3.3%. Global trade declined more or less in the same order of magnitude compared to the financial crisis, about 1 percentage point less than in 2009. Now here, as our work intends to estimate the impact on exports-related jobs in the EU, I'm giving you a kind of a screenshot of the EU economy and the impact of the crisis on goods export, services export, real GDP, and employment. So if you looked at this chart, you'll see that in 2020, actually, the European economy was hit harder than the average of the world economy, almost as double as hard as real GDP decreased by more than 6% in the EU. What we also see a very strong decline in services exports by 22% and goods exports by 10%. So on average, EU exports declined by 14%. Now here, very interesting to look at the employment, which usually also from a theoretical perspective should follow GDP. We see here, however, that employment declined only by 2%. And why is that so? I mentioned that this was basically the result of a very of magnitude, very large exceptional support measures all EU countries introduced precisely to prevent real job losses, and we see that this has been quite successful while looking at the data. Now, here I'm showing you the impact of COVID-19 on merchandise trade in the EU. I believe this picture already gives first insights about the order of magnitude, about the sectoral employment that would have been very severely affected by the COVID crisis if those exceptional export measures have not been put in place. And we see here that in terms of HS sections, declines are the strongest in the transport equipment, in machinery, and in mineral product sectors, exports of the EU27 to rest of the world. Now here I'm giving you also some information about developments in services trade. If you recall from the first chart I showed you, a services trade declined quite a lot by 22%. And we know, of course, that the majorities of workers are employed in services sectors. So this already shows you the huge impact, the huge potential impact of the crisis on workers engaged in those sectors. And in terms of decline, we see the strongest one in the travel, transport, and other businesses sectors. Of course, you have the 2019, the 20, and the change is depicted on the basis of the grayish bar. So now I'm coming to what we did. So basically, how did we assess the potential impact of COVID-19 on exports-related jobs? We have already seen that all these measures, social support measures, prevented that those jobs actually decline in real terms. So what we did, we used the newly released Figaro framework, and I'll say a couple of words about that in a minute, to calculate the numbers of jobs dependent on extra-EU exports following a well-established methodology. Nonetheless, I will give you a little bit the juice of how this methodology works and what is behind that. Then we basically constructed a hypothetical no-COVID counterfactual trade scenario. So we said if COVID wouldn't have hit, we could assume with a very, very large certainty that trade would have increased in 2020 following its path. So if COVID wouldn't have been there, so trade would follow its trajectory. So what we did to arrive at that hypothetical counterfactual trade flow was to augment 2019 trade data by officially published projection, the latest one per EU member state, to construct that hypothetical trade flow. Then we used as a benchmark the actual COVID-19 affected trade data to compare the number of jobs that would have been lost based on the actual COVID-19 trade data. And of course, the difference between the two scenarios represents the potential exports-related job losses. Now, maybe some words about Figaro, because I think it deserves even to introduce that to you. You may be interested in that. It's a brand new statistical product of Eurostat and GRC, which is the first European MRIO, comprising of a full set of national tables for all EU member states, UK and the US. The rest of the economies in Figaro are taken from the TIVA database. Of course, as a MRIO, Figaro tables are integrated global accounts, inter alia for economic modeling with the balanced trade flows. And the time series that is available in Figaro starts in 2010 and ends up in 2019 including. So we have the most recent 2019 data. And these tables were officially released on the 26th of May, so not more than a month ago. So now here, basically briefly explaining the methodology to how we calculate the number of jobs linked to extra-EU exports. This is also independently on the COVID crisis. This is our methodology. So what we have in input-output tables framework, we have the so-called intermediate matrices and final use matrices where we can see how much of a product is demanded by a given industry. Here I have plotted 4-country example, 2 non-EU and 2 EU countries. And this IO table way of writing the matrices has been only complemented with EU employment data at this stage. So basically we take the official Figaro IO tables I mentioned to you, and we enriched. So what the only data set that we enrich in addition to that is the employment data. That of course is per Figaro table sectoral classification, and it's measured in the number of workers employed in a given industry in a given EU member state. So starting from there, we have, I believe, a relatively straightforward way to calculate the number of jobs linked to extra-EU exports. And how we do that, we take the employment coefficients, which is the number of workers I mentioned in respect to output. We multiply that with the Leontief at birth, and in the third multiplication, we multiply that with the matrix or a vector, depending on how one does this, are the extra EU exports. And the result of this multiplication is the number of jobs linked to extra EU exports. Now, below on the same slide, you can see the two scenarios. So in scenario one, so basically what we do is we take the Leontief coefficients, which we had already calculated to prepare this analysis, and we assume that the ratio between output and employment is constant as it should be in theory. And we multiply that by the projected 2019 trade data, which I explained to you that we take official trade projections to project the trade data to arrive at the hypothetical trade flows, and to be able to feed that back into IO tables values. We apply a scalar to correct for the fact that trade statistics differed quite a bit from a national account representation of trade flow. So we apply this correction factor. And in the scenario two, basically the first two steps are the same. And then the third step, the only difference is that we take the actual really COVID-19 affected trade data to arrive at scenario two. And the difference between the two scenarios give us the number of jobs that would have been affected by COVID-19 if member states have not implemented those exceptional support measures. And here I'm moving to the results, to the first of my results slide. Here you see very clearly the impact on those of COVID-19 on export-related jobs. So we estimate that those jobs would have been 6.4 million less if member states have not implemented those measures to prevent those jobs actually to be lost. And also here you can see how those job losses are distributed across countries. I have ordered the countries in respect to the losses, to the size, to the magnitude of the losses. And you see that, of course, the biggest losses would have been experienced in Germany, followed by Spain, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. And of course, here on this chart, you see the difference between the no COVID and COVID, and then the grayish bar shows you the potential job losses. Now, we found also very important and interesting to provide more of a disaggregated result. So we went to the sectoral level, and on the right-hand side, you see the sectors that we have in this 10 sectors aggregation. And you also see the number of workers in respect to the total that would have been affected per sector. And it comes to no surprise, after I have shown you the first charts on a general trade decline in the EU, that the biggest decreases are experienced in the transport, trade, and other business services sectors. This sector accounts for 46% of the total potential job losses, followed by other services sector, and then by the machinery and transport sector, almost equally affected in terms of potential job losses. So here, it's a little bit difficult to fit 27 member states on one slide, on one chart, but I believe it is visible, the message we are trying to pass here. So we wanted to see how those sectoral potential job losses are distributed across countries. And you see that in all countries, the biggest losses were indeed in S1, so in trade and other business services sectors. However, then we see that depending on the country, the sectors that have suffered the biggest potential job losses vary, right? Like in Germany, this is the machinery sector, the transport and machinery sector that it hit the second hardest whereas in Spain and in France, for example, these are the other services sectors. So there is quite a bit of a differentiation here, depending on the export profile of those countries in respect to extra-EU exports. And here, actually, I'm at the end of my presentation. I would like to highlight again that, well, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic would have been severe and drastic in terms of job losses linked to extra-EU exports. We have estimated that 6.4 million jobs would have been lost if exceptional support measures to dampen the social impact of the crisis wouldn't have been implemented in those EU countries. These potential job losses that we have seen as well vary quite a bit across sectors, with the transport, trade and other business services accounting for 46% of the losses, followed by other services sectors with 18% and machinery and transport with 14% of the potential job losses. Now at country level, the highest potential job losses would have been in Germany with almost one-fifth of those losses, followed by France and Spain with 13% and Italy with 11%. What was also interesting that some countries like Latvia, Estonia, Slovenia and Luxembourg wouldn't have experienced almost zero job losses. So the changes in respect to the total were just visible at the first decimal point. And here, before I conclude, what we can take from this research, what is really important that actually what the EU has done, and those member states, that the EU member states, but of course these exceptional support measures were implemented in the majority of the countries worldwide. In the EU, it has had a huge social impact in terms of not letting those workers lose these jobs, which we think that only proves how successful and how timely these exceptional support measures have been. Having said that, of course, the cost of these exceptional support measures will have to be paid by future generations, but that is, of course, I believe, clear. And here I stop to give some time for discussions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for that, Sunitsa. And with that, I leave the floor open for questions. And as I indicated beforehand, you can either do so by indicating in the chat your question if you write it out, or you can indicate that you want to take it and post the question orally. So over to you, dear audience.
Hi, I have a comment.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Zonitsa. It was very interesting. In your presentation, you emphasize the counterfactual possible job loss with respect that would have happened without the government intervention. Actually,
Yeah.
I think that in point of fact, governments mostly provided income, and at least what happened in Italy, and I think in many other EU countries, is that firing was blocked. So in a sense, it was avoided formally, the loss of job. But another possible interpretation of your exercise is that these job losses are a sort of short-term impact in any kind of trade shock adjustment. In a sense, these simulation models, equilibrium models, at the end of the day, as we know, there can't be any job loss because employment is constant. But in reality, we know that job loss comes first. And then when the adjustment takes place, these lost jobs are replaced by new jobs. So in a sense, another way to interpret your result could be the short-term impact of possible trade disruption. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Luca. I think that's really that's very nice additional way to look into this. I fully agree with you, because as you say, right, it's a trade shock, and what we know from trade theory, it should be short term, right? I mean, unless that's a repeated trade shock. And thanks a lot for this comment. We actually even may add it to the paper to say that an alternative interpretation of these results may be that, but of course we will still prefer to keep the focus on potential job losses, because I do think it captures very, very well if that wouldn't have been prevented, as you say, and in most countries, to my knowledge, that has really happened. I mean, people just kept being paid without going to work. So those job losses were prevented, and that's why this exercise we have conducted gives really very nice magnitude of what would have been at stake. And the other way of looking at this indeed is the one you mentioned. I fully agree with you. And probably third way is just to take all monetary stimulus, which has not been done so far, but I was thinking about that, and kind of add up all those billions, 100 billions of euros that have been now spent as exceptional measures packages, and then to have a monetary value of what the crisis actually cost in terms of job support and dampening of social impacts. But many thanks for your comment. I think that's great.
Thanks, Sunitsa. Thanks, Luca. There is still time for additional comments or questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Go
okay,
ahead.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering whether you also took into account maybe some potential job gains in some sectors, and maybe in the services sectors and digital services sectors or things like that.
That's a very interesting point. We did not, because the net employment is negative. So in a way, what you say, as far as I understand your question, is offset, because total employment was reduced by 5 million jobs. And you're right that that's a net reduction, right? I mean, there are a couple of jobs that indeed, you're absolutely right, that have gained, especially I read somewhere in the IT sector, in all these digital services, of course, they benefited quite a bit, as well as online trade. But having in mind that the official statistics shows a decline, net, right? A net decline, that it's the difference between those jobs gains and the job losses of 5 million jobs. We did not go into that. We did not go into that.
Okay.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you.
Thank you. Further comments, questions? Well, while you're thinking, I will ask Sunitsa a question, even though I think I promised her I wouldn't, but nevertheless I will. I was thinking, on that slide you showed that I think Germany accounted for 18% of the number of jobs potentially at risk or no longer supported by exports. And that's 18% of the total EU number of, is it 18% yes. out of those 6 million jobs?
This is the 8% of the total job losses, and the total job losses, total potential job losses, is 6.4 million jobs.
Okay, so in absolute numbers, yes, that would be Germany most likely, because it's the largest European exporters.
Yeah.
Do you have any figures in relative terms which country which may have been mostly affected? I understand it's not the Baltics because and Luxembourg, because you mentioned there were negligible impacts, but what about the others?
Thanks a lot, Lars. I mean, that's a very, very good comment, because I was actually thinking the same thing for the paper. I even thought something else, which you can also share if it makes sense. Not only to do it in a relative, like you're talking about population, right? But, and that makes a lot of sense, not to say, let's see per capita, if that is indeed, if Germany has indeed lost the most. That's the one question, and I would would love to do that for the paper, to add that dimension. But I was even thinking normalizing trade, because Spain, for example, has lost much more than it would have been following the share of Spain in trade. Why? Because travel, for example, was the biggest sector that lost the most of services sector. So Spain was disproportionately harder hit due to the fact that the share of Spain travel services is so big in total services. So I was thinking one idea, but that is your idea basically, how to account for those differences, either to normalize countries to hypothetical shares, or of course to look at per capita, and maybe I would do both. Maybe we'll do both. Thanks, many thanks for that. It's a very good idea.
No, thanks. I think it would make sense in the paper to highlight those countries that are relatively most affected. Indeed, it would be interesting to see.
Yeah, we will do that.
All right. So we've still got 3 minutes, and I will give you the chance to ask additional questions or, provide some additional comments in the next half minute or so. And if not, we're gonna switch over to the next presentation, but here's your chance. And nobody's taking me up on my offer, and therefore I will thank Zonitsa for her presentation, and we go into transition mode for Luca's presentation of the next paper, which is called The Resilience of the EU Single Market. Okay, thank you, Zonitsa, and Luca, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thanks, Lars. So, welcome everybody, and the title of this presentation is The Resilience of the EU Single Market, and this is a joint work with Alessandro Antimiani from the EU Commission and Ilaria Fusacchia, that has a postdoc grant at Roma Tre University. And this is also some work that is going to be developed within an H2020 project. BAT model is the acronym, Better Agricultural Trade Models. And I'm using the future tense because I'm afraid that most of the work is still to be done. When you submit a proposal at the GTAP conference in December, you are very confident that in 6 months you will have at least a draft of a paper. But then things always turns differently, and these were difficult times in the previous months, as you know, so we are a bit late on the schedule, but we hope and we are grateful to the EU Commission for organizing this session that hopefully will provide us some useful input for future work. The presentation is not moving. Okay, so this is the index. First of all, I will say something about the motivation in terms of vulnerability and resilience of global value chains, but this is something that has already been very nicely presented by Emily Blanchard in the keynote lecture just 2 days ago. Then I will tell you something about the data and the model that we use, and this is something that I hope would be of some interest, because This is a relatively recent extension of the standard GTAP model to take into account a global value chain and the composition of gross trade flows in terms of value added. Then I will present you the simulations that we performed with two different baselines. Some results, very preliminary, as I mentioned, and then I hope to have some time to present you some thoughts about the way ahead. Now, this is the slides that I borrowed from Emily Blanchard. The big question is the role of global value chain, and more specifically, in our case, we asked ourselves if to what extent the existence of the EU, of the single market, contributed to soften, in a sense, the pain of a negative trade shock. And we think that simulation models could be a useful laboratory to set up this kind of counterfactual experiment to assess the role of different level of integration within global value chain. To focus the idea, let me show you this very simple graph. So the first point is that we slice the chain. And in a sense, if you have the alternative of carrying out all the production activity in one location, in one country, or to split it in two or more, in principle, according to some kind of portfolio model, you would think that you could reduce the risk by diversifying your portfolio. But we saw in recent months that actually longer chains are more risky, are more fragile, because basically it's enough that one of the chain link is broken for any kind of accident, and recently we saw what happened with the Suez Canal, and then the whole chain collapses, as if you had everything concentrated in one location, and this location was hit by a negative shock. So from this point of view, we need to consider this kind of different risk that you take. Of course, you have a benefit of exploiting comparative advantage at different cost in different location, but there is a price you pay. The other point is that diversification is insurance. So for each chain link, you could supply yourself only from one most efficient supplier, or you could decide on purpose to have several suppliers. Of course, also in this case, you pay a price, but this is sort of an insurance premium that you pay, because in case one source of supply fails, you can rely on others. So you see that in this respect, international trade is a sort of insurance with respect to the concentration of production in one location, and of course, this single location could also be the home country. About the model, this is a model that we presented in the Journal of Global Economic Analysis, and this model relies on a lots of theory about these new measures of trade in value added. And for a nice review of that, there is a background paper provided by some Italian colleagues to the World Development Report 2020. These measure fragmentations are not easy to calculate. There is some kind of messy matrix algebra involved, and you have code available in different software, MATLAB, R, Stata. But what we did, and especially Ilaria did in her PhD dissertation, is to code it with the GEMPAC software. So basically, we have some possible vectors of total exports, trade flows, or final demand. What is crucial are the Leontief matrix of the input-output coefficient and the diagonal matrix of the share of domestic value added. And when you multiply V times L, you get a possible breakdown of all possible value-added sources across countries and sectors. And this is a very important piece of information, because basically with that you can decompose imports in the case of trade flows, and you see that between country S and country R, some of these imports into R are used as for final demand, either because these are final goods or because these are intermediate goods used in R to produce final goods. But some of the intermediates provided by S to R are embedded into exports that R provides to the rest of the world. And you can do that with income, value added, but you can associate this with a lot of other interesting features. Zonitsa just did that, for example, in terms of job, labor. You can do that with factor of production, water or natural resources. You can do that with emission. And yesterday, and there are a few sessions that we had in this conference about carbon emission and their role in international trade. And of course, you can do that with respect to trade or with respect to final demand, looking at the final consumption. In terms of the model, the main changes are about the production structure. In this respect, we didn't change the structure, but we introduced a positive elasticity of substitution between domestic and imported intermediates. In terms of trade, in the multilateral, multi-regional input-output tables version that is used for the value-added computation, you have imports that are differentiated according to the different agent, firms, household, or government. But in the standard version, you still have the same elasticities applying to each different agent. We try to do something better, so we started from the HS6 estimation of the elasticities provided by the CP. Then we split these different goods at the H6 level between final intermediate goods using the BEC classification. Then we need to aggregate these different products to the GTAP sector level of the simulation that you use. And we did that using CAS aggregators consistently with the structure of the model, using the substitution elasticities that is provided with the GTAP database. And then we applied the ratio between intermediate and final goods elasticities that we get from the CP database to the SUBM, the Armington elasticity level that we find in GTAP. We decided to do that in order to avoid too much disruption to the structure of the model, but still we have some kind of differentiation between different import use. This is the aggregation, 25 countries or regions, 29 sectors. What you see in red are the EU countries that are represented individually in the database. And this is important because all of our results will be in terms of these 10 countries. And the reason is that if we include the aggregate rest of the EU, we would get something spurious in terms of domestic and foreign value added, because what is domestic for a region is of course foreign if you take into account individual countries, and what is export for a single country is domestic consumption for a larger region. And there is a constraint that you face when you try to use the GEMPAC software to compute this gross trade flows disaggregation in terms of the number of regions, individual countries and sectors that the model can handle. So this is the baseline, so 2014. These are some backward participation numbers. So this is a traditional index in the traded value added literature. It's the foreign value added embedded in country exports. You can see that there are large differences across the EU countries, and the intra-regional foreign value added is a significant share of total value added. And you see here a comparison with other extra-EU countries. Be careful in this kind of comparison, because of course USA, it's a single country in the model, but it's a region, so to speak, comparable to the EU as a size. And of course, this share also is affected by the position that you have in the value chain, if you are more upstream or downstream. For example, this is the forward participation. So in this case, you see the domestic value added embedded in export that it's further re-exported by the first destination country. So of course, if you are more upward, you provide raw materials, you have a higher forward participation than if you are more downstream and you have a higher backward participation. This kind of index is computed by the model, and these indexes are completely consistent with the traditional value-added index that you find in other databases, for example, the trading value added by the OECD. We also have an additional baseline. We call it a shallow single market. So basically, we assume that something bad happened. For example, a negative trade shock to trade the cost in terms of intermediates within the EU. And this, in the model, of course, leads to a decrease in the backward integration. So basically, you can see that the within EU integration decreases. This is the blue and green color bar. And of course, there is a substitution, so there is an increase in the extra EU foreign value added. When you consider the EU as a whole, there is no difference between backward and forward, because of course, what is foreign value added embedded in export for an EU country is also the foreign value added that is exported to another EU countries to be further re-exported. This is the idea of the EU platform that is often quoted. Our scenario, as we mentioned, is even if the session is about COVID, is not COVID, is not even close to it, is a very simple and stylized negative shock. So in this case, the increase in trade cost affect all the possible use, not only intermediates, and all the countries in the world. What we do is we implement the same shock into different baseline with different level of integration within the EU. And the first results in terms of gross trade are consistent with, I think, some sensible expectations. So you can see that the intensity of gross trade flows within the EU, the decrease is smaller in the case of the regular baseline with respect to the counterfactual, less integrated EU baseline. But if we look at the role of intermediates in export, the backward integration or forward integration, we see a different story. So basically, the share of foreign value added in export after the negative trade shock increased. And this, in a sense, suggests that in terms of adaptation, the solution provided by the model, not by policymakers as we know necessarily, is that it's better to rely more on imported input. And something also interesting is that there's this kind of bouncing back in the case of the less integrated EU scenario. And the explanation is that actually we say that we decreased the integration within the EU, but we decreased that with a temporary shock on AMS. Is not a permanent change. And so in a sense, when the model with the new baseline perform a new simulation, it tends to go back to the previous, in a sense, equilibrium in terms of level of integration. If we really want to do to build a counterfactual scenario with a lower integration, we need to do something better. I will come back to that in the conclusion. This average value for the EU, 10 EU countries, of course, hides very deep differences across sectors, and you can see that in many sectors there is an increase in the share of foreign value added, EU foreign value added, in the baseline regular baseline, or in other sector you have a larger value for the less integrated baseline. And of course, there are large differences also across EU countries. last slide. In this graph, we have on the horizontal axis the foreign value added level in the baseline, and in the vertical axis the change in output. Now you see that some sector after the negative shock increase production, some sector decrease production, and in a sense this is the mechanics of any equilibrium model. If there is a plus, there must be a minus somewhere. But what is interesting is that even if we didn't run any regression, there is somewhat as a positive correlation. So sectors that are initially more integrated seem to be less affected by the negative shock than sector less integrated. And I think this is also something that is quite interesting. This is the same picture, adding with the yellow point what happens in the less integrated scenario. Everything moves to the left, because of course, by purpose, by design, in this scenario, we have a lower level of integration of foreign value added in exports to start with. But you can see that in terms of the vertical axis, the points are more or less on the same level. So in a sense, this shock didn't lead to different behavior in the two scenarios, and perhaps this is due to the fact that this was a very simple, perhaps simplistic shock with a uniform change, and this is a sort of, I don't know, numeraire shock that doesn't really perform differently in different scenarios. So what we get out of that is that we need to think harder about how do we design our shock. And I come back in my conclusion to the guiding principle by Emily Blanchard, and she suggested that we need to appreciate the diversity of risk. And we need to do a better work on the shocks in our simulation. So we can have different types of shock, demand shock, supply shock, market wedge, but we also need to think about correlated versus idiosyncratic shock, or to think about local versus global shock. And in a sense, this is a kind of a challenge, because to model this kind of risk in a deterministic model is not obvious. Something also that I mentioned that I think is very important is to take into account the difference between a temporary versus a permanent shock. And if we want to imagine a different baseline, we want to introduce something that is permanent. This leads me to the second component of this appreciation of the diversity of risk, is that you want to work on the shock, but also on the baseline. So you can have the same shock into different situations. And I ask myself, what is this kind of dystopia that we can think of today? What if we didn't have the single market? No, it reminds me of a novel by Philip Dick, The High Castle, where Nazi and Japanese had won the Second World War. Now, it's not a nice future, but if you want to build that, perhaps it takes more than a simple shock on the trade cost. And then we need to think what is the counterfactual. So if we want to slice the chain and compare to this situation, if you think about my simple diagram at the beginning of the presentation, we would like to have ideally two different sectors with the same output but different level of foreign value added, so different component of input by abroad. Or you could have the second idea, diversification as insurance. So in this case, you would like to have a sort of a mean preserving spread. So the same level of imports with different number of suppliers. And then if we are able to build such a different baseline, we could see how the model reacts to the same shock in different situations. Coming to the other guiding principle.
1 minute, Luca.
Sorry?
1 minute.
Okay, I would like to be fast. So let me try to use my 60 seconds on the first one, because I think it's very important. Allow for butterfly effects. We can take into account butterfly effect with our input-output global tables, but there is a lot of improvements in this respect that can be done. Something has been done using this BEC classification to avoid the proportionality assumption that was used before, so that the same proportion of input from each possible exporter was applied both to final intermediate goods. But there is another proportionality assumption that is still there, that each sector used the same proportion of foreign input by different sources. And we know that this is not the case. So we need to have better microdata to feed into our global table to get better results. And of course, I think that CG models are the ideal tool to measure what can be and not just what it is. But to go back to the title, resilience, perhaps to respond to stress and go back to the previous situation, perhaps it would be better assessed with dynamic rather than static models. I stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luca. Thanks for that presentation. And I open the floor for discussions. And as during the previous presentation, you can write your question, comment in the chat, or you can indicate that you want to post it orally, and I'll give you the floor. The floor is open for questions. I think I see at least that Zonitsa has raised her hand. And if that's correct, Zonitsa, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Lars. And Luca, many thanks for this really super interesting presentation. I have actually a first couple of questions before I have one or two comments. Did I understand correctly? Because you have you showed us very often two bars. One, what you call less integrated but still EU, and then somehow integrated EU. Is that the country aggregate? Is it in the one case where you call it integrated EU, just the rest of those countries you had single out as EU country, and so you basically compare the aggregate as a whole, and then the countries like what you had, Germany, some other countries that were basically singled out? That's my first question. The second question, I think indeed the shock here is basically is the most important thing, right? Could you confirm that, as far as understood, is that really an AMS shock? So it's kind of, is it like a kind of a technological cost at the border? Can you give us a little bit more info exactly on the shock? Is it, is the same shock applied to all sectors, all countries? What is really the shock design? Because I really believe that this is would be very, very important. And then I have two comments. The one is, in respect to your looking forward, and I do agree the shock would be very, very important, but also the countries, right? I mean, like in the EU, the difference between the North and the South for such type of simulation, it is crucial, right? I mean, the share of foreign intermediate inputs in value added or in exports varies quite a lot among the countries, but also among the countries' profile and sectoral patterns. So this would be very, very interesting, maybe to somehow to single to try to single that out. But again, I can only say that the shock is so important, because I would think this research would be very valued if you could indeed simulate a little bit COVID. We know what type of intermediate inputs were the ones that disrupted global supply chains. And if you could kind of look at precisely at shock of those inputs, because you can identify them pretty easily. We have papers on that, and they basically try to simulate, it could be an AMS, again, a disruption in supply chain of critical products, for example. Then it would be, I believe this analysis would be kind of very, very, it become even more interesting. And I stop here, thank you.
Do you want me to answer to Zonitsa, or should I wait?
No, please go ahead. For the time being, we have no further raised hands and nothing further in the chat. So please go ahead, Luca.
Zonitz, I think that this is a very interesting discussion that I'm sure we will carry on in the future. So basically, in general, I think that baseline are as important as shock. And I did a very bad job in presenting the baseline due to the hurry. So basically, all the results that I show are about the 10 individual EU countries that you saw in the aggregation. So the scope in terms of countries are those 10 countries. The difference is that in one case is the baseline, 2014. So what is in the data? In the other case, it's a counterfactual where this kind of within the EU negative shock on trade and only intermediate goods trade took place. So the difference is that it's a less integrated EU region. Whole EU, even if the results focus on 10 countries for the reason that I mentioned. The way ahead, I think that I can understand the interest of modeling COVID-19 or something specific, but perhaps for my academic background, I like more the idea to try to have stylized shock typologies, and then to see how these different typology of shock in terms of local, global, permanent, transitory, final, intermediate, you can have a lot of different possible columns in an ideal table, apply to different baselines where I would like to differentiate baseline in terms of integration to show what type of shock has a different, more severe or less severe impact in different cases in terms of integration. So this is my conceptual framework, but I mean, it's just an idea.
Well, many thanks. And just on the shock, Luca, so is it an AMS kind of unilaterally applied, or how is it exactly?
It's AMS, just a shift in the trade cost.
And across the board, across sectors and countries? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Luca. Thanks, Sunitsa. Further questions and comments? I'll ask you a question, Luca, then. I think it refers a little bit to what Sunitsa was about the shallow integration in the EU. How you simulated a more shallow integrated EU also with an AMS shock? Is that what you did, or can you explain that to me again, please?
Yes, I'm a bit embarrassed because it's a very rough characterization of a shallow integration, but the idea is that we put some additional cost to the trade in terms of intermediates within the EU. This is just that, but as I show you, it does have an impact in terms of for EU foreign value added embedded in EU export.
So when you do that, sorry, when you do that, then you increase trade cost intra-EU, and that will then result in a reallocation and more EU imports from third countries. And that's what, okay, I see what you do. Okay, thank you. I give my audience another 10 seconds for additional question and comments. Otherwise, we'll move to the third presentation. Well, that's basically 10 seconds. Thank you very much, Luca. Thanks for your presentation. And we move then over to the third and final presentation in this session, which is called The Way Forward, the Impact of Future Trade Policies on Global Trade Patterns. And it's going to be presented by Jean Métivier from the World Trade Organization. Over to you, Jean.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So let me just share my slides. Okay, so this is a paper co-authored with Mark Bacchetta and Eddie Bakers from the WTO. So it's entitled The Way Forward, Trade Policy's Impact on Global Trade Patterns. First, before starting, let me also, I'd like to thank the staff that helped the organization in the organization of the conference, and in particular Ginger, who is also with us today. So briefly, the overview will go over the objective in the context of the paper, the model, the scenarios we have, and some results, which are also preliminary results. So first, what do we do in this paper? We're trying to explore the consequences of different potential future trade policies. So we're kind of asking ourselves what could be the path for future trade policies and exploring the consequences of this. Why do we do this? Well, in the recent years, there has been some issues or even some disagreements on trade, and here I've mentioned a few. Of course, unilateral trade wars and tit-for-tat tariffs exchanges, the Brexit, some debate about industrial subsidies, trade and services, digital trade, labor standard, and the dispute settlement system. So in this paper, we don't cover all of these trade-related issues, but we try to take them into account in the way we think about the scenarios and in the way we model our scenarios. About the model and the baseline scenario, so we're using the WTO Global Trade Model. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. You can find further description of the model in AGR and OR 2019. But so it's a recursive dynamic CGE model. About the data calibration, we're using the GTAP 10 database with the year 2014 as of year of reference. Just a bit about the baseline scenario, which has been updated. Some of you may have listened to the presentation yesterday by Daniel Orlov, who worked on this update of the baseline. And here I'm focusing on updates related to trade and trade costs. First, we have some changes in tariffs that we implemented, in particular the conflict between the US and China in 2019. We also implemented some reduction in tariffs based on the MACMAP database, where they have collected the reduction in tariffs from economic partnership agreements. And so this includes all preferential trade agreements in force until May 2019. And so that's a forward-looking database until 2050, actually. Then we also have some changes in non-tariff measures, and this is modeled through changes in iceberg trade costs in our model. First, the Brexit. So here we have an increase in trade costs between the EU 27 and Great Britain, well, the UK. Then some reduction in trade costs due to the trade facilitation agreement that has been implemented in 2017. And we expect all countries to have implemented all provisions of the TFA by 2040. Some also trade reductions due to, well, free trade agreements. And here we're using the death of free trade agreements. That has been collected in a database and made available by Jura and Old 2014, and also some trade reduction due to digitalization. Again, you can find additional description of this paper and updates in the baseline in Bakers and Old 2021. About this paper, so we're constructing three main scenarios. First is a revival of multilateralism. So within the WTO. Second scenario where we explore some plurilateral cooperation, and in particular in the data and e-commerce and in the services sectors. So we have two sub-scenarios here. And finally, a third scenario where there is a geopolitical rivalry with two blocs emerging. So about the first scenario on the revival of multilateralism, we also included both some tariff reductions and some non-tariff measure reductions. Under the tariff, well, we first get rid of the US-China conflict that was implemented in our baseline, and then we decreased tariffs further based on the negotiations that were running during the Doha round. And so this is also based on a paper by Adler and al. 2009. In terms of non-tariff measures reductions, so we use a 50% reduction in NTMs, which is quite standard in the literature, using a database from Key and Nisita 2016 for goods, and a database from Hochman and Shepard 2020 for services, from which we can compute ad valorem equivalent. Just to give you an idea of the initial level of tariffs and non-tariff measures, so here in the first column, we have tariffs. In our model, we have 25 regions that are represented here. We've tried to also represent like least developed countries, main countries, but keep the region to 25 in order to ease the run of the model. And then we have NTMs for goods using Nisita and Key database, and for services. So when there is no data, it's just because there was no data in the database. The data was missing. But what we did for the scenario and for the shock is that we extrapolated the data for missing countries in order to shock all countries. So we did this for both NTM in goods and for services. And I mean, as you can see clearly, I mean, of course, there still is some tariffs, but non-tariff measures, and in particular in the services sectors, are much more important. About our second scenario, so here we're looking at the plurilateral cooperation, focusing on data and e-commerce. So the issue was kind of to think about which countries would be interested in participating in such cooperation on this topic. And so what we did is that we used countries involved in the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce as kind of a reference for countries that would be interested in such plurilateral cooperation. But our goal is not to model the GSI on e-commerce, just to know which countries could be interested. Then what do we do? Well, we use the STRI simulator provided by the OECD and play around with it in order to liberalize regulations on cross-border data flows. And so in the STRI, you can, so for each country, each sector, you can select which regulation should be on or off, and this changes the STRI score. And so here we focused only on cross-border data flows, liberalizing regulations on these provisions. And so once we had our new STRI or updated STRI, we could compute the ad valorem equivalent based on the change in the STRI score and on coefficients that were provided by Benz and Yax 2020 from the OECD on digital trading services. Again, to see kind of the change in the STRI that we impose, or at least how does the STRI change when we liberalize provisions on cross-border data flow. So here we have the initial STRI by region, and the change in STRI in percentage, again by region. And so as you can see, China is really the country that would have the largest change in its STRI score when we liberalize provisions. Some countries such as Canada or Mexico or even the US have zero or very low change in STRI. Second scenario on plurilateral cooperation is a plurilateral cooperation about services sectors. And so here again, we're using the Joint Statement Initiative on Domestic Services Regulations just to select a group of countries that would be interested in plurilateral agreement on services. But once again, our goal is not to model the GSI on domestic services. And what we impose in terms of shock here is a 50% reduction in non-tariff measures on services sectors only, and only for those countries that are participating in the GSI on domestic services regulation. Last shock is the geopolitical rivalry. And here we separate the world in two, and so we have a bipolarization of the world between the US and its allies versus China and its allies. And the separation is based on political science literature, in particular the work of Kleinman and All 2020, in which they use UN voting patterns and similarity in UN voting patterns to create an indicator of political similarity between countries. Once we have created these blocks, we increase tariffs and non-tariff measures outside of each block, imagining there would be a breakdown in multilateral relations, and tariffs and non-tariff measures remain constant within each block. So we decided not to reduce trade costs within each block for now. To have an idea of the shocks that we imposed. So here I have summarized all the shocks. So first we have scenario 1 with multilateralism. RTT is just the reverse trade tensions between the US and China. And as you can see, the reduction in tariff is most important for China and for the US. Then we have the reduction in tariffs based on Doha round negotiations. And so I've kind of used a code of color, red being the highest reduction and blue the lowest one. So in red we have China and Korea in particular that would have one of the highest reduction in tariffs in this scenario, compared to Mexico and Sub-Saharan LDC that have lower tariff reductions. That's then for NTMs. So the reduction in NTMs for the first scenario. And so India has one of the most important reduction, which makes sense if you go back to the previous slide where I showed you the level of NTM by region. India and actually also Indonesia were one of the countries that had really high NTMs, especially in the services sectors. Then we have the shock in the plurilateral scenario. So on e-commerce, and again, as expected, China would have the highest reduction in NTMs. And this is from the change in the STRI that I showed you earlier, as well as Indonesia. For the services plurilateral cooperation, again, we have China that would have the highest reduction in NTMs, followed by the EU and Russia. And some countries, again, have no change, such as the US, Sub-Saharan LDC, India, and this is because they are not participating in the GSI. So we didn't include them as, we didn't shock these countries. Finally, under our geopolitical rivalry scenario, so here we're increasing both tariffs and NTMs in all sectors. And what we see that India would be the country with the highest increase, followed by Asian countries and Russia. And this is mainly due to the fact that we split the world in two, with some countries joining the US bloc and other countries joining the Chinese bloc. And so we will see some trade deviations. Just about the results, so we have some preliminary results, and here I'm focusing in change in real GDP and real export by region and by sector. So this is for the multilateralism scenario. as we can see in terms of GDP, Asia LDC, so least developed countries, and Sub-Saharan Africa LDC would be the one that would gain the most. Same thing in terms of exports. And this is mainly due to an increase in their services, exports of services. We have here quite of a surprising number with Latin America that would be losing in terms of GDP. For now, we think that this is mainly driven by the macro closure, and we'd like to explore this a bit further in future work. Moving on to our second scenario, so the cooperation on e-commerce. So here I've showed again the GDP, total exports and exports by sectors, but only showing services sectors that are affected by the shock. And so here we have Eastern Asian and other Asian countries that are gaining the most in terms of GDP. This is mainly due to the trade and utilities and constructions sectors. Why is this? Well, this is mainly driven, these results are mainly driven by the large change in the STRI that we had seen for China in particular, and also the fact that the trade and utilities and construction sectors are the most affected ones. May also be due to the coefficient that we use that is highest for trade and utilities constructions. In terms of pro-rata cooperation for services, so here we have Europe that would gain the most in terms of both GDP and exports. Again, this is mainly due, to an increase in the services sector, since here we're lowering non-tariff measures in all services sectors. And Europe is one of the main exporters of services. And we have, some countries that are kind of losing out, in particular, not countries, but regions, Southeast Asia, Southern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa LDC, Asia LDC also on the top, and Sub-Saharan African other. And we see that, of course, this reduction in exports and also in GDP is driven by the services sectors that is being hit. And one of the reasons could be that some countries are not included in our shock as interested in such type of cooperation. And we're also thinking about creating maybe a different shock, because for now the shock on pro-rata cooperation is discriminatory, meaning that the set of countries that we have selected as potentially interested in such cooperation reduces non-tariff measures only with partners that are also part of the agreement. And so that's also what's driving the results. So we'd like to explore maybe a different scenario where the pro-rata cooperation would not be discriminatory, but would be achieved within the WTO framework and on a MFN basis, because I think we would have different results, especially for those countries that are maybe not joining. And last, the geopolitical rivalry scenario. So again, we have change in GDP and exports, total exports, and then by sectors. So here, all values almost are negative. So again, this is kind of expected because we're raising trade costs, both tariffs and non-tariff measures between blocks. There is also some, there is some trade diversion with some countries exporting more within their blocks, and that's maybe also why we have like a little positive sign in North America. But countries that, for example, if we take a country like Japan that's exporting also to partners that are geographically close and ends up being in the US and allies bloc, then you have automatically some trade diversion effect and losses. So just some takeaways in terms of what we have seen so far. The first scenario, which is on the revival of multilateralism, would still bring overall gains, even if we want to look a bit further at this negative sign for Latin America. The opposite would be true for the geopolitical reversal scenario. And about the plurilateral cooperation, well, this kind of raises questions. And in particular, in terms of the way they're implemented, whether they're discriminatory or implemented in an MFN basis. Now, just to take some, just to look at the results for a broader perspective, these results are not final, they're preliminary, and I think we can still maybe do some work because these results have raised questions. Rather than actually giving final answers, and especially on the plurilateral cooperation. And some points also require a bit more attention, such as the first scenario on multilateralism. Well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. And as before, I open the floor for questions, either in terms of raised hands or in terms of text in the chat box. So over to you, my dear audience.
I don't know how to raise a hand, but I have a question.
Well, you can do this.
Okay.
Go ahead, Luca.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a curiosity. It seems that non-tariff measures play quite a significant role in the simulation. And you use ad valorem equivalent. So my question is, how do you handle the revenue from this ad valorem equivalent in the model?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I would have to check that actually.
Well, the chat box indicates that those are iceberg costs.
Okay. Oh, yeah, they're iceberg costs. Yeah, sorry, these are not tariffs.
Okay, thanks. No, it was just the use of the term ad valorem equivalent just misled.
Ah, yes. Sorry, they're ad valorem equivalents, but they're modeled as iceberg trade costs.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Which also means, as it indicates in the chat box, that there are no rents, so these are resource losses. So any further questions or comments? Any hands? I don't see any hands. And by the way, if you want to raise your hand, what you should do, I think, is that you should hover with the cursor over your name, and you should see a hand then show up, and then you click on that hand, and when you do so, I should see it. That's the idea anyway. I see Sunitsa putting on her camera, and now I also see the hand. So with you, Sunitsa. You're muted.
Okay, thanks, Lars. Jean, many thanks for a very interesting presentation. I believe the work you have carried out is impressive and pretty comprehensive, right? I mean, you have 3 scenarios in the second one with 2 sub-scenarios. I mean, it's really kind of, it's a very comprehensive paper. I believe it's very policy relevant.
Thank you.
similar questions to the one you tried to address in the paper. So just before I assess some more specific comments, I think it's a very relevant paper for policymakers. So I would be looking forward to have the final version when you probably publish it. Now, just a little bit, some suggestions maybe. I think, and that also boils down a little bit on what Luca said, I had the same impression. I mean, I believe the majority of your results are driven by the MTMs, and the shocks you have applied, that's now another totally different direction, but the shocks you have applied, I believe, are pretty large. You have 50% cuts in NTM, more or less across the board. And my suggestions would be to do some work on that, because, like, just to give you an example, what you did in this plurilateral scenario for the e-commerce negotiations, where you went to the STRI and then removed kind of a data protection legislation and saw the change in the score, that's really a very thorough, detailed work, which made a very, very good impression on me. If you could look how to refine this 50%, I don't know, maybe looking back at other rounds that have been negotiated and try to have really the change through an econometric estimation or whatever, just to make this cut that is really super high, to try to found that in some literature, or to try to a little bit kind of tailor-made it so that it sounds a bit more founded, like what you did for the plurilateral cooperation in e-commerce, for example. I think that would raise a lot also kind of the credibility of the results, because again, you have, of course, not provided that, but the vast majority of the results will be driven to the NTMs, because tariffs are very low, obviously, and that's why NTMs are super important. Now, a little bit going further, I was also surprised by this negative change for Latin America. I don't know, it just somehow, there is something which is striking in that respect, and indeed, yeah, you should explore further, because it shouldn't, I mean, in theory, well, that's not to be really expected, that change. And then something just on the presentation of the results, if you could also present total changes would be great, because so far you have only regional changes, but like a total, how is the world better off or less off, kind of adding that. I think it's super important also for policymakers from kind of a multilateral perspective, just to have the total figures. And my last comment is on the aggregation. I mean, at some slides, you had countries split out, like China, when you presented us the trade costs reductions across goods, NTM services, and tariffs. And then when you present the results, there is no countries that are singled out. So I was a little bit surprised. So I think it would be very good to have these countries singled out, because, of course, in a region, there are many multiple effects that play together, and it's for the kind of the reader, for the use of this research, it would be very useful to have these countries that you had singled out, to have those results for them presented separately. So that, I think, would be good. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you for your comments. So about the scenario on the plurilateral cooperation in services. So we use the 50% reduction, which is, again, quite standard in the literature, but I agree that we could do something a bit more specific. And we were actually thinking about using maybe the work by Hoekman and Shepard that's quite recent, and they're working on the GSI initiative on domestic regulation. So we could probably find in the literature some data in order to have a maybe more detailed scenario here. For the second point on Latin America and the negative sign, yeah, we were also quite surprised at the beginning. And so what we would like to do now is to fix the trade balance, to see whether this is just due to the macro closure of the model. We didn't have time before the presentation to do it, but that's our next step. About the totals for the total change in the presentation, that's true. I think we were so focused on countries, but totals are very interesting, and especially for the first and last scenario, multilateralism and geopolitical rivalry. To be honest, well, for the total for multilateralism, sorry, the whole world is benefiting. So on a global scale, it's beneficial, and it's the reverse scenario for geopolitical rivalry. But it would be nice to have the numbers. I agree, and I think that's something to add in future presentations. Also for the plurilateral agreement, even if they just focus on a few countries. And about the aggregation for the tables, so yeah, we use a model with 25 regions, 25 sectors. And so when I looked at the change in CRI, etc., I had everything for all 25 sectors. It's just to present the result, it was a bit easier, especially on slides, to have even larger aggregation. And maybe I could have presented also like which country is in which larger aggregation of region. But I think when we'll publish this paper, we'll have the full table. It's difficult sometimes to make it fit nicely on the slide. But thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the comment. I'll just add on to that I also find the shock to be huge. I mean, we don't achieve anything near that in bilateral free trade agreements, and I think they are usually more ambitious than what we do at the multilateral level. So maybe you would want to think about that. And another comment or reflection is also the levels of those NTBs that you showed on one slide, where I saw that the EU level of NTBs were even higher than the NTBs in sub-Saharan African LDCs, which of course can be the case, but intuitively it's not what I would have expected. So I guess it depends a little bit on what's included in those NTBs. If it is, SBS measures which are related to food safety, yes, I could imagine that that perhaps they can be quite high. Yeah, this is what I mean.
On this slide, right?
You have 8.86 for the EU, and for the sub-Saharan African LDCs, you have 8.62. And for the US, it's only 1.04. So I don't know, it just strikes me as somewhat odd. But we are running out of time. I just want to make that reflection. And I also would like to say that there's yet another comment in the chat box. It's a question about how you divided the countries into the US-China trading blocks. I think you had a reference to that, but when we
So I couldn't hear you very clearly at the end, but I can quickly answer to the question on the chat. So we divided the countries into two blocks based on some indicator that we found in political science literature, and you can find the reference actually on the slides. And so what the authors do is that they use UN voting pattern, and based on the UN voting patterns, they compute a score of political similarity. And since for this last scenario, we wanted to look at geopolitical rivalry, not so much into trade, usual partners or things like that. We really wanted to use an indicator of political similarity. And this indicator of political similarity is just computing the frequency at which two countries vote in a similar way at the UN UN General Assembly.
Okay, thank you very much. And what you probably did not hear was me saying that I was surprised about seeing North America gaining from the rivalry scenario in terms of GDP output. But I wouldn't have expected to see that. But that's maybe something else that you also say that you need to go back and look at and dig deeper into to see what's behind. So
Exactly.
with this, I want to thank you, Jean. I want to thank the other two presenters, Anitza and Luca. And I want to thank the audience for being here this Friday, which can be different parts of the day depending on where you are. So we'll close the session with this, and I want to wish you a good rest of the Friday and a good weekend. And I hope to see you back maybe in some other session of this conference or at the conference next time. Thank you and bye-bye.